All right. Well, I am living in Vancouver, so I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm conducting this work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. BC Nature is committed to reconciliation, decolonization, and building relationships within all of our communities of our clubs. In the early summer, we hired an Indigenous communications liaison who's helping us guide us through this work, and I'm really excited to see where that takes us. BC Nature, if you're not familiar with it, is a federation of local naturalist clubs across the province. And we have a very lovely mission to know nature and keep it worth knowing. So when we took on this project of protected areas, we felt that it perfectly aligned with this mission. The Municipal Protected Areas Project is in collaboration with 4 other partner organizations across Canada, including Wildlands League, Nature Canada, Alliance of Canadian Land Trusts, and Ontario Nature. And this is a wonderful group of different organizations to help bring this project across Canada. This project is undertaken with the financial support of Environment and Climate Change of Canada. So, what exactly is the Municipal Protected Areas Project? Well, very broadly, there are a few main focuses of this initiative. The first of which is simply to raise awareness of this goal that Canada has committed to of protecting 30% of its land and water by 2030. And also raising the awareness of the important role that municipalities and local governments can play in achieving this goal. When I refer to municipalities, this is a very broad term that we've been using to cover all types of local governments across Canada. So this also includes regional districts. We are excited to celebrate the roles of local governments as they're in a unique position by owning and managing much of the remaining natural areas in densely populated areas, and also continuously developing areas. Not only that, but much of the population are most familiar with their local natural areas. So we hope that highlighting this work in people's own backyard will facilitate greater awareness and engagement of this project. One of the main goals of this work is to support local governments in recognizing which of their natural areas meet the standard of protected lands and entering them into the federal Canadian database known as CPCAD. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you. So what is the driver for MPAP, the Municipal Protected Areas Project? Well, last year at the 15th conference of the parties known as COP15, the United Nations set 23 targets for nations around the world to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. Unfortunately, as we all know, biodiversity loss is a critical issue facing our planet.
All right, next.
Target number 3, which is on the screen, is a target that Canada agreed to follow, which is to protect 30% of our lands and water by 2030. The 30 by 30 commitment. And I have to say, as an Irishman, that's probably the hardest sentence for me to read out possible, as I can't pronounce my THs. Anyway, this commitment, the commitment of 30 by 30, is the inspiration and sets the framework for the Municipal Protected Areas Project. Over to you, Catherine.
All right, so to some, the 30 by 30 goal can feel pretty ambitious. And so this is why we're breaking it down into different steps to figure out how to get there. The first really important part is identifying and cataloging where we currently stand. So figuring out how much of Canada is already protected through various different mechanisms. This could include bylaws or conservation covenants, and various other protected areas. And so we're here to help municipalities figure out this cataloging process while also encouraging additional protections. I'll come back to that on a later slide, but here right now, I'm showing you what has been entered into the federal database by the end of 2022. So currently, well, at the end of the year, it was about 14% of terrestrial area and 15% of marine territory across Canada. British Columbia has also committed to achieving 30 by 30. So we're tracking how much of land and water within the province has been entered into the database. And again, a snapshot at the end of 2022 showed that about 15% of terrestrial area has been entered and only about 3% of marine areas.
So I love this quote by Ann Dale, a professor of environment and sustainability at Royal Roads in Victoria. Protected places, species, and spaces must exist everywhere. They're not out there, but must be part of human life everywhere. For me, this is the essence of what MPAP is all about. It captures the importance of local governments who are in everybody's community. It is vitally important and integral that all levels of government work together on this 30 by 30 commitment. We all know that local government areas are home to rich biological diversity. We all know they also play a critical role in local adaptation to climate change, especially under extreme weather events, which unfortunately are becoming all too common these days. It's also been recognized by the federal government that local government natural areas are underreported in Canada, and they're seeking through this project, MPAP, to correct that and register a lot of locally protected areas on CPCAD, the federal database. And they're asking us to help them with that. So why participate in MPAP? Well, there's many different reasons. MPAP can raise a profile of current protected local government areas to a national level. I would say that most local governments, if not all local governments, have done excellent work in protected areas, and this can be celebrated at a national level. Conversely, MPAP can bring a biodiversity commitment made at a national level right down to the community, which can help the desire by people to do something to address climate change. Very helpful in that regard. Also, we're finding in our work to date that MPAP is very helpful in validating your community's approach to existing biodiversity policies and approaches. For example, this quote that's on the screen is from the chair of the Capital Region District on Vancouver Island, and he emphasized this point in their announcement of all CRD parks being placed on the federal database for protected areas earlier this year. In addition, as we noted earlier, we can leverage our connections with local nature clubs to promote greater collaboration and engagement, and to generate excitement with local governments in biodiversity projects such as MPAP. Lastly, when you document what you have, you're always in a better position to seek future support and resources for conserved areas.
All right, so this brings us to what exactly are we talking about when I say a protected area? I know that this is a pretty broad term, and two people may be thinking of vastly different things when they hear it. So Canada has decided to follow the IUCN definition of a protected area listed here. A clearly defined geographical space, recognized, dedicated, and managed through legal or other effective means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystem services and cultural values. So there's quite a few different elements included within this definition, so I'm going to break it down a bit. An area that qualifies for the Canadian Federal Database, CPCAD, basically has to meet four main criteria. The first of which is it needs clearly defined geographical boundaries. It needs to achieve in situ conservation of biodiversity, So there needs to be maintenance of ecosystems and natural or semi-natural habitats and the viable populations of species within their natural surroundings. There needs to be mechanisms in place that are prohibiting actions that are not compatible with conservation. And finally, the intention of the space is to be protected forever. So there are two broad categories of lands that can be entered into CPCAD. The first of which is the standard protected areas, which I kind of just covered, where the primary purpose of the space is conservation. The other type is called an other effective area-based conservation measure, or an OECM. And this is a space that still meets these 4 criteria listed here. However, the primary purpose of the space is not conservation. So a good example of that might be a watershed. Over to you.
Thanks. So what does BC Nature bring to the table? A lot, in my opinion, and also at no cost to the local government. We can assess municipal lands for a registry with the federal government. We can undertake the registry process. I'll have Kefra explain about that in a few minutes. We can also engage with local clubs to promote and generate excitement about conservation. We can use local clubs to help us gather more information about your local areas. We can provide information to municipal staff for the protection of lands. And we can help identify opportunities for new lands to be conserved and protected. These are the things that we bring to the table and bring to the table of local government. So with that, I'm going to ask Kefra just to talk a little bit about the registry process.
Sure. Okay, so I know that I boiled down the criteria to 4 main things listed just on the previous slide, but the actual process of demonstrating if an area meets these criteria can be quite lengthy. There's a lot of paperwork involved and gathering of different resources. And we recognize that a lot of local governments do not have the capacity to do that work themselves. So we're here to actually do that paperwork for you and then send it off to you for final approval, make sure that you're happy with all that's within it. And then we will also be able to submit that final paperwork to the CPCAD, the federal database team, to be entered, and then it will show up on that database after they have reviewed it.
Thank you, Kefra. So local clubs and community participation, they're both key components for MPAP and for BC Nature. This participation can range from a community understanding and awareness of the 30 by 30 commitment to utilizing your local BC Nature Club or your local conservation club in getting more information about biodiversity in your community's protected areas. I'm sure there are members of your community who are true experts of biodiversity, who know your areas very well. As noted on the slide, your community members can assist MPAP in many ways, including undertaking BioBlitz, to offer advice on new areas to be conserved and protected. Through MPAP, we can celebrate your community members' knowledge of rich biodiverse areas. So what are the next steps? What is the call to action? Well, first, we ask you that you complete the short survey that will be issued after this webinar. Or you can contact Kefra or I directly, and we'd be very pleased to talk to you and discuss about the next steps With this in mind, I will ask Kefra to explain what happens next. Kefra?
Sure. All right, so we encourage you all to reach out to us for a more personal one-to-one conversation about your local community's context. What we have found is that each local government has vastly different mechanisms in place that support the criteria that I've gone over. And so we need to cater this project to each specific context. And so that conversation will really help us figure out what the next step is for your jurisdiction. And I will just cover a few of the things that we would like to discuss during that short, maybe 30-minute conversation. First, we'd like to get you to think about what potential candidate sites you'd like us to assess. And so these are areas that you think probably already meet all of the criteria, but you don't need to be certain of that. We can do that legwork for you. One thing I'll highlight is that the areas that you choose, the local government must be the managing authority. And that ties in with a consent form that we need to get to be able to complete this assessment process. We'd also like you to start thinking about what protective mechanisms are present within your local government. So as I've mentioned before, there's many different variations, but some of the common ones that we've come across so far in previous work have been dedicated park bylaws, restrictive zoning types, or conservation covenants. And then finally, we want you to think about who might be the person to sign this consent form. And Andrew, could you speak a little bit more about what this consent form involves?
Sure. So the consent form is not an onerous document. It's a very simple document. It just says we give permission to BC Nature to undertake an assessment. And then we also ask in the consent form, with more permission, we would then submit that submission to CPCAD. So any staff person can sign the consent form. It's a very basic form. However, in saying that, I would recommend that this would be viewed as an opportunity to inform your community about CPCAD and the 30 by 30 commitment, and about what land and what areas you have protected in your community. So we would suggest that you could use MPAP, this project, as a way to inform and promote your protected areas in your local community, and a way to celebrate, okay? So what we're expecting with some communities is that we would be going to mayor and council or the political representatives to seek permission to register these protected lands, existing protected areas on CPCAD.
Yes, and we could support any presentations that you may need to do to those different councils if necessary. Okay, and then finally, the type of information that we will need to gather to be able to do this assessment are listed here. So first of all, of course, the names of the candidate sites and their current designation. Sometimes, however, there have been candidate sites that don't even have a name yet, and so there's ways around that, so don't let that stop you. We need to have the site boundaries as spatial data. And if there's any GIS specific questions on the call here, we have Adam Soames, one of our team members who's our GIS whiz. So happy to bring him on board for any questions on that afterwards. We also, the key element really is documentation or evidence of mechanisms that are in place that are preventing incompatible activities. So again, this could be bylaws or policies, but really what we need is some document that clearly lists out or shows what activities are allowed and not allowed within that space. And finally, evidence of biodiversity conservation outcomes within that space. So this could be inventories of species or monitoring reports. We recognize that sometimes this information is not always available for all natural sites. And so this is definitely a place where we're drawing on strength from our naturalist clubs, in that they often have been doing monitoring of sites that municipalities or local governments do not have the capacity to do themselves. So those are the main things that we will need to gather, some of which we will ask you to provide if it's not publicly available, but we will certainly try and gather as much as possible through what's available online.
Yeah, also with the, if you go back that slide, with the documentation, zoning is also a key component and can be used to help us document that this area is protected. and also master plans. For example, a parks master plan, or can distinguish which parks are protected or which parks are more natural based. And then again, that information can be used by us in the registering at CPCAD.
Great. Yeah, thanks for those examples, Andrew. All right, so that concludes the presentation portion of this webinar, and I will stop the recording now to leave the rest of the time for questions.